The Cold War. Most people are familiar with World War I and World War II, but whenever they hear about the Cold War, they can only think of the Call of Duty game, as it's rarely talked about as much as the two world wars despite being more influential on the world. But this is Dr. Gene, and today we're going to have an oversimplified understanding of the Cold War. So right after the World War II ended, Germany as well as the rest of Europe was left in shambles. This left the world with two superpowers. One of them was the United States, which took very little damage compared to Europe thanks to its distance from Germany. The other was the USSR, which despite suffering the biggest human loss and being severely damaged, started quickly expanding its influence around the Eastern world and building itself as a bad nuclear motherfucker. Despite having fought on the same side in the world wars, these two weren't anywhere close to friends. They only fought together due to Nazi Germany being a threat to both of them rather than them being allies. So now, the world was left with these control freaks. To the west you had the capitalist US and its capitalist allies, such as France and the UK. Then to the east you had the communist USSR and its communist allies, such as China and most of Eastern Europe. These two even turned Germany into their bitch, not only dividing the country into pieces, with each having its own source of influence, but they also did the same to Berlin, even building a wall to separate the communist and the capitalist sides in 1961. In 1947, just 2 years after World War II ended, the US launched the Marshall Plan, essentially giving aid to European countries to rebuild themselves. However, the Soviets felt like a baby daddy whose baby mama is dating a rich man giving her kids expensive gifts all the time. They essentially told the US to leave its allies alone and to go fuck itself. We don't need you pushing your capitalist propaganda in the name of aid. Years later in 1949, tensions were rising, especially with the Soviets going into O-block mode and testing its first atomic bomb. This, alongside communists taking over Czechoslovakia and the Berlin blockade, led to the creation of NATO, essentially out of fear that the USSR and communists would try to expand west. NATO is essentially an alliance made between the US, the UK, France, and several other countries in the name of an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. Of course, they wouldn't say it was made out of fear of Stalin, so we wouldn't call them pussies. It was also in 1949 that Communist China was established under Mao Zedong, aka Weird Haircut Dude. The first 3 years of the 6th decade of that century were spent fighting in Korea. You had the North backed by the USSR and China, and the South backed by the capitalist West. The war went on from 1950 till 1953 and ended in a stalemate, as in Korea stayed divided. This, however, was the first in a series of proxy wars, where both the US and the Soviets didn't have the balls to fight each other directly, so they just backed different sides in third-party countries. But then the Soviets were like, yo, these NATO bitches can have an alliance, but not me. And that's how the Warsaw Pact was formed in 1955, which is essentially a Soviet version of NATO. We're now in 1957, and the Soviets felt like taking over the world wasn't enough and said fuck it, let's take over space, launching the Sputnik satellite, putting a start to the space race. Life under the Soviet regime sucked, leading too many people from East Germany fleeing west. Stalin felt rather jealous and built the Berlin Wall in 1961, which became an iconic symbol of the Cold War. And just 1 year later, the world nearly fucking ended. Basically, America woke up feeling diabolical and installed missiles in Turkey, around 1,000 miles away from Moscow. The Soviets said fine bitch, and installed nukes in Cuba, even closer to the US. At that point, we almost stopped existing. Thankfully, the leaders of both countries did a lot of yapping, and they both removed their nukes. We go back to proxy wars in 1965, where we had the Vietnam War with North Vietnam backed by communists and South Vietnam backed by the West. As you all know, the US and France lost the war, and the American military completely backed out of Vietnam by 1975. It's more complicated, but this video isn't about the Vietnam War. The US, however, wasn't ready to take the L, so when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the US knew it was its time to shine and funded rebel groups in the country, one of which would later become the Taliban. Seems more appropriate to fund the government to fight against the Soviet invasion, but okay. I guess it worked out for the Americans, as the Soviets took a terrible loss there. For years later, the world would once again almost end. In all simplicity, some Soviet machine malfunctioned and showed that the US sent 5 nukes on their way to the USSR. Soviet leaders ordered a direct attack on America in response. However, a Soviet officer called Stanislav Petrov determined it was a false alarm, saving the world from a nuclear war. 2 years later, Stalin signs out and Mikhail Gorbachev takes over Moscow. He introduces several reforms, such as glasnost and perestroika, which is essentially an economic restructuring. This kind of made the tensions go down a little, despite the war in Afghanistan still going on at the time. 1989 was the beginning of the end, as the Soviets finally back out of Afghanistan and the Berlin Wall falls. This, coupled with multiple protests in communist countries, led to the weakening of the Soviet Union. The war finally ends 2 years later in 1991, when the Soviet Union finally collapses, leading to the creation of several new countries, such as Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, and the end of the Cold War. So basically, the Cold War was a non-direct feud between the capitalist USA and communist Soviet Union for cultural and economic control over the world. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Wasn't easy to make, so I would appreciate it if you subscribe, like, or both. Thanks for watching.